Thanks very much, Jim, for that very kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming here and to all of those of you tuning in. And a further internet note that if you want to follow along at home, you can find copies of the slides that I'll be showing on the Identity Project website at papersplease.org. Since September 11th of 2001, the U.S. government has implemented an extraordinarily comprehensive system of surveillance and control of our movements, both within the country and abroad. Bits and pieces of it have been called out from time to time, but I think there's been little understanding of the comprehensive big picture, which is what I'll try and give you as quickly as possible today. The first step is the ID requirement of people having government-issued ID credentials in order to travel by common carrier. Not so much to prevent people without government-issued ID from traveling, although that's an incidental bad effect, but in order to ensure that each act of travel can be logged and correlated into the second component of this process, an ID-linked lifetime personal travel history of your movements, on the basis of which the government has then been able to move to a permission-based travel control regime in which real-time decisions are made each time you want to go somewhere as to whether the government will let you on the basis of your identity and on the dossier of history linked to that identity. Finally, once that permission system is in place, the government has made the final step of flicking the default from yes to no, so that rather than a presumptive right to travel, which can be interfered with only on the basis of judicial action, the presumption is that nobody's allowed to travel unless they've received affirmative government prior permission. So, I think the government's insistence since 9/11 that everything about airports is different and not subject to any of the usual rules has made it more difficult than it should be to put these things in perspective. I think actually that a good frame of reference for comparison for travel surveillance is the surveillance that's gone on of communications, CALEA in particular, and the NSA's warrantless wiretapping. They have in common with travel surveillance that they're recording movements. In one case, movements of messages. In the other case, actual movements of your physical person. Both have involved unfunded mandates and burdens on industry, in the case of CALEA on the telecoms. In the case of the programs I'm going to be talking about, more than $2 billion by the DHS' own gross underestimate of mandated modifications to travel industry IT systems in order to support performing these government surveillance and control functions. Finally, these systems have in common that they are suspicionless dragnets, not limited to suspects or people who are being particularly investigated, but collecting information about everybody in case it might later be of interest to the government. But although travel is not sui generis in the way the government says, there are still significant differences. One is in the legal framework in which, oddly, at least in statute law, communications and the movement of our messages currently has more legal protection than information about the movements of our physical bodies. That seems weird, but that's the way it is. Congress doesn't seem inclined to fix it. The second big difference, perhaps bigger difference, is in how the government uses this data. This is not merely a panopticon of surveillance, but an active real-time control system. It's a bit confusing, and this is going to be a bit technical, and I will grant that everything I'm going to say from now on is a gross oversimplification. Otherwise, we'd be here for days or weeks. Travel IT is complex and technical, and DHS has confused the matters by its own inconsistency of policy and language over the last decade as the system has evolved. There are three different sets of not entirely identical but overlapping data that the government has required airlines and travel companies to collect and make available to the government, depending on whether it's an international or a domestic flight with different names. There are also different systems with different names: secure flight for domestic travel, the automated targeting system for international travel. There's also a difference that probably isn't as significant as it looks, which is in the case of international travel, DHS actually makes its own mirror copy of the reservation information, whereas for domestic travel, it merely maintains real-time access. But again, that doesn't matter so much. All of the controls on privacy of this information that the government has talked about are controls on its copy, which are meaningless as long as it can go back to the industrial host of the data and get another copy whenever it wants. So who's holding the copy really doesn't matter as long as the government has root access, which it does. The people who designed these systems at DHS, who mostly came from NSA-type backgrounds and knew nothing about the travel industry, assumed after 9/11 to be really easy, they would simply get the information that the airlines have about travelers and make their own use of it. But it doesn't really work like that because most airlines outsource the hosting of their reservations to companies called computerized reservation systems or global distribution systems, which also serve other travel companies, hotels, travel agencies, and so forth and so on. There are 4 major and 1 more recent and as yet minor, Google, which spent $700 million 2 years ago to get into this business, which gives you a sense of how significant a business it is, which together form, in a sense, a outsourced global cloud for hosting of reservation data on behalf of the entire travel industry. If you look at this diagram, you'll notice a couple of significant things. One is that there are typically at least 2 intermediaries between the traveler and the government. This is why the government can get this data from the travel companies without needing a warrant, because under the third-party doctrine, it's considered their property in which the traveler has no right. The traveler doesn't necessarily even have any way to know whether the government has gotten this data. But of course, being a global cloud, each node in the cloud is a point of vulnerability. Vulnerability to exploitation of this data by marketers and data miners who may be completely unknown and invisible to the traveler, by criminals, from hackers to terrorists, and by government agencies, not merely DHS, but other law enforcement in the U.S. and foreign governments and their law enforcement agencies around the world. Now, in Europe, there's been a great deal of concern that, as this diagram example shows, someone traveling within Europe on a European airline making their reservations through a European travel agency, even when the master copy of the reservations is stored in Europe, there still may be multiple mirror copies in the cloud in the U.S., which DHS can access here without anybody in Europe, even the airline, knowing about it. And if you say, well, so what about Europeans? The converse holds true as well. Even if you're traveling within the U.S., pick your bogeyman, any government in the world where either the airline or the reservation system or the travel agency has an office can get access to it. For example, the Chinese Public Security Bureau can go to the United Airlines office in Beijing and ask them to call up your reservation from Washington to Chicago. And they can do that. And they're required to because they're Chinese citizens subject to Chinese jurisdiction and law. And they can hand that over to the Public Security Bureau in toto. No record is kept of this by the reservation system. It is not visible even to the airline that this has happened. And unless you or somebody you know happens to be looking over their shoulder in that back room in Beijing when it happens after the fact, there's no way to know whether it has happened. This is TSA's own incomplete diagram of how this process works on the government side. There are many incompletenesses here, but I want to focus and complexities. But I want to focus on a few things here. You'll notice that the what's called aviation booking entities over at the whatever. The aviation booking entities over at the upper left are merely shown as a passive pass-through rather than as the centerpiece of this. They're not shown as connected directly to the DHS at all. It's shown as going through the airlines. Actually, you should cross out those airlines going to the airlines. Those should be going directly into the aviation booking entities where DHS has root access. Over on the right side, you see that this is more than just what TSA may describe as watch list matching. It's a much more complex real-time process of evaluation. We still have the threat analysis is still a black box. It's shown here as a red box, but it's still, there's nothing about what goes on and how those decisions are made. There's connectivity to other law enforcement, to a call center that can reach out, call the police, have them come to the airport and question you. And there's a piece, this diagram was published by TSA before the latest updates to the system of records notices for both the secure flight and ATS systems, showing that they now have real-time access to other commercial databases, credit reports, whatever, that they can access as well on the other side. But what may be most significant is something that's hidden over toward the left side of this diagram. This is an enlargement of that section from another version of this diagram from TSA. You'll notice that there is passenger data moving from left to right, from the traveler to the airline to those who evaluate it on the government side. But you will also notice that there are arrows going back from right to left, labeled boarding pass printing results. That's the permission message, and those lines are the control lines that DHS has demanded be built into the infrastructure that prevent the airline from issuing you a boarding pass until they've received that individualized per-flight, per-passenger message from the government. Now, you might think that if they're stopping you from flying, that might implicate the law. Indeed, it does. The TSA is fond of saying you have no right of travel by any specific means. That contradicts express statutory language, not only guaranteeing your right to travel, but specifically guaranteeing your right to travel by air, and specifically obligating TSA in its operations and rulemaking to consider that right, as they never have done in any rulemaking to date. Now, if they're not following the law, can we get it reviewed in court? Ginger will be talking a bit more about that one later, but it's also interesting to look at what the express policy of the DHS has been. These statements are from speeches by former Secretary of Homeland Security Chertoff, who repeatedly said that he did not believe that no-fly orders should be subject to judicial review, which is a remarkable statement from a former federal judge, saying that he thought his decisions as DHS secretary should not be subject to review by the kind of person he used to be back when he was a federal judge. And while these are policies of DHS under the Bush administration, no Obama administration official has repudiated these views, and indeed it continues to be DHS practice, not so much to defend the systems that I'm talking about here, but to actively resist being obligated to defend them before any court at all. So what is in the records that they compile? Your lifetime travel history. If you've traveled across U.S. borders in the last 10 years, DHS has a file on you. With the Identity Project, we've put out forms for people to use. You can find them on our website at papersplease.org or on my website. We've been compiling the responses. Eventually, I sued for the portions they had withheld. After stalling me for 3 years, CBP retroactively exempted the automated targeting system records from the Privacy Act, and the district court upheld the retroactive application of that exemption. But they did, in their discretion, release quite a bit of self-damning information. Some of the information that we know is there and have seen, and I'll show you examples, include complete copies of PNRs, passenger name records. These are airline reservations, but they also include non-airline data. An index, a log of every time you cross the border by any means, and free text notes attached to that give more information about whatever they deemed of interest. This is a very simple passenger name record for a flight, as it happens, from Washington Dulles to Ezeiza Airport in Buenos Aires. What's interesting here is some of the kind of associational data. The only contact information for me in this reservation is the phone number of a friend that I gave when I reconfirmed my flight, who was intrigued and somewhat surprised to know that he'd been permanently linked with me in our Homeland Security files. This is another simple reservation for a flight from Montreal to San Francisco. Here we see, down here on the left side, this is an IP address and a timestamp. So that can be correlated with whatever other internet records might be associated with this. Of course, there's also the email address, the credit card number, permitting them to pull in a lot of other associational data. These are wonders for the government for social network analysis, and in fact, that's what they talk about using them for, to find people who are not yet suspected. This is deliberately a guilt by association machine. That's what it's designed for, and that's how it's used. It's not limited to air travel or travel to and from the U.S. This is a trip I took to Brussels. Lines 3 and 4 in this reservation reflect the portion of that trip from Paris to Brussels and back by train. What's that doing here in a permanent DHS file? This one, similar, this is a trip to Strasbourg, France. Line 4 is a ride on the Lufthansa highway bus from Strasbourg to Frankfurt. Here, this particular PNR extract is the smoking gun that showed that DHS has route access. They're not merely using an airline user ID. They have their own user IDs with route privileges. This person traveled to Berlin, stayed there for a week, then traveled on via Prague to London, stayed there for a week, then came home. Lines 3 and 4 are a journey entirely within Europe. It was the rest of the PNR, which I cut out here to show you this, shows that this was a separately issued ticket, not connecting to or from a flight to the U.S. on an airline that doesn't fly to the U.S. United Airlines, if you called up the reservations to Berlin, would not have seen that. Only a user with route privileges would have been able to retrieve that, as DHS did. Everybody who I've spoken with who's gotten their file from DHS and brought it to me and said, what does this mean? When I've gone over it with them, there's been something that surprised and disturbed them in their file. Most of the time, once they've seen that, they don't want me to put their file on the internet. But each of these things here are something that I have seen in actual examples of files that people have received in response to their requests. And remember, this is just the stuff which, in its discretion, DHS chose to tell us. Hotel reservations, if they're made, whether or not they show up is a complex question, but they sometimes do if they're made in the same reservation with the flights. And I've seen in them, in a reservation for multiple people, linked together with their name, their gender, their age, date of birth, and so forth, the code showing behind the closed doors of their hotel room whether those two travelers asked for one bed or two, in their permanent lifetime file accessible to the government wherever. Special meal requests, which may show religion, a special service request, which may show invisible medical conditions. These show up routinely. Reservations for tours or cruises. Again, the nature of the tour, or the tour operator, the demographic, there's a lot of other information that may be more revealing than you think in these kinds of services. Billing codes are routine. For example, law firms routinely have their travel agents enter in their PNRs what client they're billing the trip to. Again, this is everything that the travel company captures for its business purposes. It's just hoovered up wholesale by DHS into your permanent file. There can also be discount codes. For example, if you get a discount because you're part of a group that's traveling to a particular conference or event or convention, that billing code may reveal what organization's convention you were attending, even if it's an organization that is normally very resistant to disclosing its membership lists, as many are. The second component of these files, in addition to the reservations, is the entry-exit log. This is an excerpt from mine, showing entries back to 1992, even though the notice that was supposed to be published in the Federal Register before this system came into operation wouldn't be published till 14 years later in 2006. Operation of a system of records without a proper notice is a crime nobody's ever been prosecuted for. Funny thing. This information is not just limited to flights to and from the U.S. It also includes overflights of the U.S. This is a great concern, for example, to Canadians who, if they go on vacation in Cuba, inevitably overfly the U.S. So the U.S. has access to a list of all the people who've flown to Cuba on their vacations from Canada. And if you say, well, I don't care about that, what about the reverse? Imagine the reciprocal. What would happen if Cuba were to say, and I've routinely been in Cuban airspace on American Airlines flights between Miami and pretty much anywhere in South America. What if Cuba were to say not only that they want the passenger manifest and all the information that the airline has on everybody on any of these flights, but that the Cuban government is going to vet them in advance and nobody gets on one of these planes on American Airlines unless the Cuban government approved? What would we think of that? That's what the U.S. government is now demanding of other countries. Again, it's not limited to air travel. This is a log entry 2V, is the code in airline systems for Amtrak. This is a trip I took by train across the U.S.-Canadian border between Montreal and New York. Here's one for a trip by private car. More recently, the CBP has installed license plate readers at the border crossing, so a more recent comparable entry would also include the license number of the car that I was riding in. And then finally, there's the free text notes that can be associated with any of the entries in this log. And these are not just people who were arrested or suspected. These can be entered even when nothing was found. Negative computer queries for criminality wants and warrants, negative vehicle exam, subject is a U.S. citizen. In this case, this was somebody who walked across the border. Why is this recorded in their permanent file? For what conceivable purpose and use? This is one of my files. I flew back from, well, I won't say, but I connected through London. And had an apple and some bread when I got to customs. And I said, can I keep these? And they said, you can keep the bread, but the apple's fruit, so you have to throw it away. I threw it away and thought nothing of it. Some years later, I find in my file that I'm permanently linked to this event. On another occasion, I had been at an agricultural industry expo in Buenos Aires. It's a major industry there. And I checked the box, as you're supposed to, that says, I've been around livestock. So you may not know that what happens when you check that box is that in thoroughly biblical sense, the Customs and Border Protection people get down at your feet at 5 o'clock in the morning in Miami when they've just come on shift and wash your shoes with disinfectant. Well, okay, if they get off on washing my shoes, they get off on washing my shoes. But why does this belong in my permanent file? This is actually from John Gilmore's file. He had a book entitled Drugs and Your Rights. Again, if this is not prohibited recording of the exercise of First Amendment rights, I don't know what is. Again, from another trip that John Gilmore had taken, passenger was traveling for about 1 month. Passenger attended computer conference in Berlin and then traveled around to visit friends. 100% baggage exam negative. Passenger is self-employed, quote, entrepreneur, close quote, in computer software business. I guess being an entrepreneur is a suspicious fact that belongs in your permanent file. There's more to all of this. I hope that all of you will be inspired by this to look into what is in your file, but also to look more closely at the reality of how that is being used and what we need to get out of the situation we've been put into, where we now travel by common carrier only as a privilege granted by permission of the government. Thank you.